Welcome to the Children's Grief Center's Parent Lunch and Learn on neurodiversity and grief. I'm excited to offer this session to our community and also to others who kind of come back and check out these Lunch and Learn sessions online at a later time. This topic is, I guess, a passion of mine. And so this is a really cool way to end our Parent Lunch and Learn series for this year. So as you know, if this is your first time attending or you've been many times, we started these in September 2021, the fall last year, really to offer direct, concrete information for parents who are parenting grieving kids and teens. And we chose topics that address some of the most common concerns and questions and areas of challenge for grieving families. So if you haven't seen some of those and you're curious, you can go to our website and find those available there. There are sessions from development to trauma and grief, the holidays and grief, going back to school, what's grief, what's just bad behavior, grief in the body. We've covered quite a few things. And today we're going to cover neurodiversity and grief. So I think my hope for this session is that it's an invitation to consider neurodiversity for exactly what it is, which is that it is not a deficit, it's not a disability that needs fixing, but rather that it's a way of engaging the world differently and equally valid and valuable. And that includes the way that neurodiversity and grief come together. And so this isn't going to be a session where there's tools to plaster on to change the way that a neurodiverse person grieves, but rather tools and awareness that can help us come alongside and support them in a way that's meaningful for them, for how they show up in the world and how they process the world. So one of my hopes is that out of this, you'll be able to normalize for your child, your teen, or anyone in your world who is on that sort of neurodiverse spectrum, that there is nothing wrong with their grief, that it is, unique. All grief is unique and varied. And there are some limits, and we're going to talk about that, some biases that have been kind of the rule of the day about how grief should work. And I think grievers in general experience those a lot, and they come up against those and they don't fit and they don't mesh with their experience of grief. And then people who are on the neurodiverse spectrum really experience that kind of double dose of it. So there is a lot of information in this session. If you've joined me for previous sessions, you already know that I sort of like pack it in heavy. And so encourage you to take a look at these boxes that I've sort of made for us. This is the lay of the land. This is where we're going. This is what we're covering. Obviously, you're not going to retain or connect to everything that I say. And as always in these sessions, I am offering invitations and information. And there may be things that just don't resonate for you or they don't fit you, the child that you're supporting. And that is okay. So take or leave, take what fits, leave what doesn't. But as we go through, I just want to offer you these boxes as you're collecting some of the information that I'm sharing. It's like, how does this all tie together? So this is our path today. This is where we're going. So we'll start just by defining neurodiversity and what I mean when I say it. And because you're going to keep hearing that word, and hopefully we end up at a wider place, a more spacious place of understanding what that means. And in some ways I wrote, it's almost redefining how we think about neurodiversity. We're going to talk specifically, obviously, this is a grief session. So we're going to talk about when grief and neurodiversity meet, and some of those common features that are different about neurodiverse grief and like why it's different, the why part of it, what's going on in their bodies, in their way of processing the world. It's important that we understand that as we create supports, as we kind of create interventions, if you're a clinician or a school support worker, but even as a parent. So this how to help piece is how we'll close up. So let's go ahead and dive in. I want to start with this. I just love this. But this phrase of like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole is something that parents have spoken a lot about. And as a parent of a child with, neurodiversity, I totally get that. Particularly in grief, it is imperative, it is critical, it is necessary that we look at grief and the griever through a very wide lens, understanding this, that our own experiences, our education, it can never contain another's life world. I think no matter how close we are to them, even as parents or family members of someone who is sort of uniquely wired in the world, that our own experiences or the experiences that we haven't had, that impact the way that we have formed, and also our biases, our beliefs, our assumptions about the way things should go and with the ways of experiencing the world. And so this work by Sonia Aranza is something that the CGC we're working with, but I want to offer it here to say, this is really, really important as we support grieving kids and teens, that we may not understand, and that's okay. Let's acknowledge that we don't understand, and then gain some awareness as you're doing here on this session. Widen the circle, find ways to invite an inclusive mindset, to acknowledge the value of this diversity, and sort of kind of come against those ideas that use words like disability and disorder and dysfunction, and just recognize it as difference. We're going to talk about how grief norms connect to this and make grief for neurodiverse folks harder. I don't love this slide too much, but I just wanted to offer it to you as a visual around, if we're talking about what is neurodiversity, it lands in all these zones and more. I think the reason I don't like it is that it almost feels like these are all really negative kind of categories, that they're hardships, and sometimes they are, but this is not a good enough story. This is not the whole story about neurodiversity. But I just wanted to, I think sometimes people think autism, neurodiversity, and I just want to open that up. And for example, this mental health and well-being slice is totally not full enough, because neurodiversity includes people with OCD and anxiety and sensory processing challenges. And even down here, acquired cognitive conditions. It has something, you may have a traumatic brain injury, things may be changed. You also may have sometimes people with fibromyalgia or another health condition. Their bodies, their nerves might be changed and altered in the way that they process information, and can create some of these same pieces around neurodiversity. So I just wanted to kind of offer you this wider view. So those learning disabilities and ADHD and autism, and there's just uniquely wired ways of being in the world that don't even have these labels. So these are just the best we have for now, but just want to kind of widen that. Also want to define these terms, because you're going to hear me use them a lot, but neurodiversity is just basic understanding that we recognize that as human beings, there is difference in the way that we think and process the world, our reality. So neuro being, like the brain, and diversity, just this difference. And that's how we're going to think about it today, because there was a study that showed approximately 15% of high school students would qualify as neurodiverse, and nearly 20% of the population. That might be more than you thought. So if you think about that, one researcher put it this way, I thought that was really helpful. It's more common than having red hair or being 6 foot tall. Wow, kind of puts it in perspective. So it is more common. It's becoming more of a buzzword, and maybe that's why you're here. You've heard it. If you're parenting a neurodiverse young person, you're probably quite aware of these things. So you may find some of these words they fit or they don't fit, and that's okay. We're just going to use these as handles the best we can. You will hear me use the term neurotypical. And I think the old word for this would just have been to say normal. But I love this definition of neurotypical that says it's really a description of a person who shows up in the world, who behaves and thinks and talks and processes information in the ways that we're all accustomed to. That's really all normal means. And so that's what I mean when I say neurotypical in this conversation, in this session. And then neurodivergent or neurodiverse are people who show up in the world, process information, their behavior might come forward in a way that is not considered to be normative or acceptable or like equally as valid or as successful in our culture. So I hope that makes sense as we plug along here, and feel free to kind of plug in the term that, you know, is really fits for the people that you know, or even maybe yourself. Let's begin here. We've defined what I mean in this session for neurodiversity. Also, April is Neurodiversity kind of Awareness Month, and that was a coincidence for offering this session, but it's kind of cool. So let's shift into that second box of when grief meets neurodiversity. I love this quote by Deborah Lipsky, who wrote a book about grief and autism, and she writes about it from an adult perspective, but I think that it's a really helpful tool when you're trying to gain an understanding of what it feels like to have neurodiversity and be grieving. It's for a lot of kids and teens, it's actually hard to be able to articulate those things. So though there may be differences, and we'll talk a little about that, you know, having that offering from someone who has had that experience helps us grow and helps us provide better support, more skillful support, and more appropriate, you know, support. So our grief is different. It's not non-existent. And because neurodiverse folks show up in the world, as we just said, in ways that are sometimes not considered normative, with feelings, with relationships, you know, so their emotions, their relationships, and even sometimes the way they're processing, there can be assumptions that they're not grieving. And that is, you know, incorrect. I think that's obvious, the way you wouldn't be here. But just want to kind of hang on to this as we go. Let's pay attention to how it is different. Again, just to kind of lay the groundwork here for grief and neurodiversity to meet. And this whole concept of human diversity, neurotypical people have created a mostly neurotypical world. And inside of that, it means that what people experience, what's okay to experience grief, to express it the way that you're showing it, as well as the beliefs and the rituals for mourning, those have been shaped and passed down to all of us inside of our context, inside of our family context, cultural context, is how you see those things there. And so because a neurotypical culture has guided for all this time what is considered normal, acceptable, and valid, it creates an extra barrier, an extra challenge for those on the neurodiverse sort of spectrum. And one thing I've commented on before is that there's this phrase that you may have heard called disenfranchised grief. And it's when grief is sort of set out, the grief is not acknowledged. It's set outside the bounds of what's normal or acceptable or validated. And because the expressions of grief, the way that it shows up for people who are neurodiverse, it may lead their grief to be disenfranchised, sort of like this. Right? Not being able to recognize it as very valid, very real grief, and even very healthy grief. I have this one titled Grief Through a Neurodiverse Lens. And what I want to highlight here is all people, but let's just talk about children and teens for the sake of this conversation. When they're grieving, it requires this constant movement, this state of attempting to move between your inner world, the world that exists within them, as this says, and the external world you have to show up in and function every day. So when kids teens, neurotypical kids and teens are going through this. It is taxing. The questions are like, what's happened? Why has this happened? Where am I going? Who will take care of me now? These dominate the thinking of all kids and teens who've experienced a loss due to death. And it is even more intense for someone on this sort of neurodiverse spectrum, if you'll let me call it that. Another piece is that this idea that grief is ongoing and it happens across the lifespan. It's still true, but it may look a little bit different for with neurodiversity because of the way that they do process information in very concrete and black and white and contained ways. And so we will talk a little bit more specifically about that. But that uncertainty is disorienting in a different way. Of course, it's disorienting for everyone. It feels like you have no firm footing. But because folks who are neurodiverse require routine, everyone benefits from like routine and structure, but for their sense of regulation and stability and calm, they rely on it even more. There's a bit more inflexibility, and we're going to talk about the why of that, but it can be disorienting in a different way. It's hard for all kids when the person who maybe anchored them into that routine or in their life and those rhythms is the person who's died. And for kids who are neurodiverse, it creates even more kind of primal sense of panic and fear and a sense of threat, like a sense of actual threat. One other piece I wanted to acknowledge is that with neurodiversity comes the extra challenge when you're just before grief of this navigating the inner and the outer world, because the outer world is full of stimulation that a person, the way their brain is processing information, it is overwhelming. It might be often overstimulating, and they're spending a lot of energy moving between kind of inner world and knowing and outer world and expectation. And so then you add grief onto that, and that's also a normal part of grief. And this is a double challenge. It's one of the reasons that if we look at a neurodiverse response to grief through a neurotypical lens, right? This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to widen our lens. It can look insensitive and selfish, or like they lack feelings. Back to that quote by Deborah that said, it's not non-existent, it's different. And it can look like, yeah, they're not having feelings of grief, or because we're using our own as a measure of, and sometimes we're not even using a realistic one, as a measure of what is good grief or what is normative grief. And, for example, I think most grievers understand that there's these formulas that for grief, or these prescriptions around grief that don't fit grief, period, regardless of the way that you process, reality and information, whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent. And, something like the 5 stages of grief, it doesn't fit most grievers, but somehow we've had these ideas passed down to us that there are prescriptive ways, there are the best, the right even ways to grieve. And, those don't fit any griever, and they certainly don't fit neurodiverse grievers. So I just want to highlight why when we look through a neurotypical lens, neurodiverse folks can get that label of like they're self-centered or they're not feeling anything. It's because of, one thing I've already kind of touched on, and we'll keep touching on, this need that they have. So for safety, calm, and regulation, there needs to be this maintaining, this reliance on these rituals or these routines, and those for safety. Remember how I said there's a feeling of threat when that is gone, and it is for all human beings. And there's just this extra sensitivity to that for neurodiverse folks. And so it will have to take precedence over what other people are feeling, need, expect of them, intend for them, all of those things. And if we're looking at it through the neurotypical lens without understanding the context of a neurodiverse person's grief, we're probably going to slap on some of these labels, and we're going to miss being able to support them, in their grief. So let's look a little closer, and we're going to do that together. Just this reminder, we don't want to assume any griever, we don't want to assume or minimize their experience of grief. What is happening for them, their own experience of grief based on the way that they express their grief. They're not always aligned. In some of our previous lunch and learns, I have offered a similar slide that says sort of common characteristics of childhood grief, or common characteristics of adolescent grief. And so here I offer you, just as a way of kind of putting them in the box and looking at how it's different and holding it when this is a lot of information, common characteristics of neurodiverse grief. I wanted to make sure that I added this piece around decrease in executive functioning, because it is possible that at times a neurodivergent griever might get labeled with depression, and particularly if their neurodiversity is sort of like unlabeled, or there's a lack of awareness or identifying of neurodiversity, because in times of stress, every human's executive functioning is going to be weaker. Dr. Amashi Jha does some really interesting and cool research and sharing about executive functioning and focus and its role in our regulation and in our lives and all of those things. And she kind of calls the executive functioning part of our brain, our focus, the juggler. So I like that kind of image. And in grief, with all the stressors that are coming, and then particularly for neurodiverse people, they're coming in at a rate that might be hard to process. The juggler can't catch everything and keep juggling it. And so what executive functioning helps us do, this isn't a webinar on executive functioning, there'll be resources at the end, but if you want to kind of dig deeper and understand this more, but just like in a nutshell, simplifying, our executive functioning helps us plan and sequence things like, I'm going to get up in the morning at 8, and then I'm going to, go get a tea, and then I'm gonna go to the bathroom, and then I'm gonna get dressed, and I'm gonna, make my lunch before I go to work. Like, it helps us sequence things. And it also helps us, like I said, it helps us make plan. It helps us think about consequences of things. It helps us even, think about the perspective of other people as well. So in grief, which we can just consider a stressor, there may be a decrease in this. And so just paying attention to that before we jump to something like depression, they can look similar. Taking care, a neurodiverse person may stop taking care of those basic needs like showering and eating and those things. And so we want to tend to those, recognizing that right now, just the ability, the capacity of that part is lower. And it's normal. It's normal in all people. And then because neurodiverse folks are already, their juggler's already juggling a lot, they may tip into that sort of decreased executive functioning in more obvious ways or more quickly. I wrote here increased traits, and I don't love the word traits, but I also wrote sensory anchors there. And we're going to talk about sensory when it comes to the why here, but want to just offer, those things that you might see people doing to regulate. So I think some of the typical ones when you think about autism, for example, are like maybe stemming behaviors, movement, repetitive speech, or lining things up. Or what's happened is they have found a sensory input that helps them organize information and regulate. It just helps that sensory processing and modulation happen smoother. And so they're really, it's kind of cool. I mean, sometimes those are annoying behaviors in a neurotypical world, but in a classroom or even at home, I'll speak for myself, like at the dinner table, it's like, oh my gosh, please stop doing that. Those may increase, and it's really a seeking of regulation, and there's more needed to help regulate. You may also see those increased shutdowns or more frequent meltdowns as the sensory system is getting overloaded. When I say increased shutdowns, I just want to highlight that because I think it can be a unique feature. It's too narrow to say that neurotypical grievers always want to be with others. But there is sort of this social component to grief. If you think about a funeral, it's pretty much a social occasion. There's so many social demands. And for neurodiverse folks who are already taking in a lot of demands, the social one can also be this added difficulty. And so you may find when there's a lot of input coming in from all the ways, all the senses, and there's trouble processing, a shutdown's actually sort of like this little landing place or a little kind of island to catch up and on the regulation, catch up on the sensory processing and sort things and be able to take in more. So not a huge piece of concern here. Again, back to how some of these traits can be considered maybe like signs of depression. And of course, talk to your doctor, reach out if these are concerning you, but these are normal parts of neurodiverse grief. Increased sensory overwhelm, it's kind of embedded in all of these, and we're going to talk about sensory. And then on some practical pieces that they may actually, as concrete thinkers, really concrete thinkers, may need like a proof of the death. They may need to see the body or some paperwork or to make it real and concrete and support their processing. Along with that, sometimes there's a concern about the way that the neurodiverse brain can hyperfocus. And so will they hyperfocus on details of the death? That is a real possibility. And if you have a neurodiverse child, you know them best. So you know the rabbit holes they go down and the likelihood of hyperfocus. And so I think you really want to see yourself as a co-investigator, as coming alongside, helping explore the facts so that they have what they need to process. All kids need this, all teens, all adults need a story of loss that's making sense. And sometimes the way that neurodiverse folks have to go and make sense of that story kind of goes down into rabbit holes in a way that might either be surprising or disconcerting to a neurotypical parent or someone in their world. So I want to kind of refer you when you're thinking about, it's outside the scope of this session to talk about exactly how to speak about death or grief, but we have a session on that. I think it's like the second lunch and learn if you go back and look at that. And really, when it comes to neurodiversity, you can just think about how would you talk to a concrete thinking child in their development? And that's how you speak about grief and loss and death for neurodiverse grievers. And so, accurate information, appropriate information for them. And so that's back to this hyper-focusing. If you know your child, you may not offer some details that could create distress in the hyper-focus. Another piece is it may look like they move through it quickly. I hear that a lot, both from grievers and from those who care about them, who are worried they're not grieving healthy because it looks like they've just moved on. I have also found sometimes kids have processed, neurodiverse kids and teens have processed the parts of the loss that they need to, at least for now. And sometimes parents and caregivers are worried because they didn't see like a really emotional response, or they do still see some, behavior or challenges, and they're linking it directly to grief, and they sort of drag that young person back to feelings. So we got to get to the feelings. But it is real as concrete thinkers, and the way they process information, very black and white, literal. They may be able to kind of move through some of those pieces in a different time. This last piece, I just want to acknowledge kids do this. Kids and teens do this. It's an important part of self-development and identity, is to like go into that inner world and kind of make it about you and make sense of the world. And but this can be a really strong characteristic for neurodiverse grievers, and it can be frustrating for those around them. But if you kind of just think about some of the things I've already said around this need to move between your inner world and your outer world, and sometimes that outer world is too much. So you kind of have to stay in the inner world. You got to protect it. Maybe all you're thinking about, talking about, that's where the energy is. And sometimes even that movement between the two may be a slower process than it for a neurotypical person. Doesn't mean they're not moving between the two. It might just be slower paced. Okay. Those are some main ones. I'm sure I've missed some. You may be thinking of, your own young person or someone you've supported, and I've missed some, but those are some big ones. If you remember, I said sometimes parents or caregivers or counselors, they wanted to like drag them back into the feelings. So when we are supporting, this is a little bit of the how, but this is still neurodiversity meets grief. If you think about the boxes we were in. This is a unique piece. So for a neurotypical griever, often we'll kind of want to start with the feelings. We'll want to build their capacity to feel their feelings. And we want to use things like you've heard like name it to tame it. Like if we can name the feeling, then it will calm down. Zones of regulation. If you can become aware of your body and the feeling, then it will kind of lower the intensity and bring you back to regulation. For neurodiverse people, you really need to start with problem solving and not feelings. So you see the line there. I've already talked about this a little bit, but they derive such a strong sense of security from those routines and rituals that we need to be able to restore the script. We need to restore that routine and give them a sense of what that's going to look like and how they can depend on it before we try to go to feelings. So I'm not saying we don't go to feelings. I'm just saying we do need to start at problem solving in order to then move to feelings. It's a little bit reversed from how we often think about regulation for a neurotypical kid or person. So we're going to start with the problem solving a lot of the time. A reminder here, as a counselor, I'm always thinking about this, that we're tending to distress and not the difference. So as I think I already mentioned, our interventions, our supports are not targeted to change the way that they are different. That's not inclusive. That's not honoring diversity. That's not validating and normalizing that their grief is legitimate. And there's nothing wrong with the way that they're processing their grief or the way they process the world. It is just different from what we have sort of come to be accustomed to and what we've come to expect. It doesn't mean it's wrong. So at times, the distress is greater for the caregiver, for the parent, than it is for the young person. Not always. There are times where there is significant distress and there's a lack of a capacity to be able to touch those feelings, identify those feelings, and be able to move through those feelings. And so it's not that there's not support or work or skill building in that area, but it's not to change it, not to change their difference, if that makes sense. So we're going to talk about regulation and control, because a lot of times as parents, there is this feeling of like, just like get that under control. And we want to talk about why in this context for neurodiversity and grief, that is really hard. And sometimes it's also just the wrong lens. One of the reasons I didn't put, I wanted to put self-regulation and self-control because we're really talking about the young person, but I left it at regulation versus control because it also includes us as parents. So, do you want to support for regulation or for control? And your approach will make all the difference. If you choose control, probably in parenting in general, but particularly with neurodiversity, and we're going to talk about the why of that, you're going to be frustrated and your kid's going to be really frustrated and you are not going to connect. It'll be a power struggle and it will leave you the space to share, you the space to hear and understand and be able to support them in the way that you want. And so we want to talk about how to support them in self-regulation. There may be some pieces around co-reg that we're going to think about, which is where you kind of come alongside as a nervous system that can support theirs. Okay, check in with yourself. I just felt my shoulders lower. Don't know what you thought when you saw this slide pop up. It's like, whoa, there's already been a lot. But the why. So let's shift into that box of why. So we've done defining neurodiversity, how we're talking about it, widening the lens, and then kind of when grief and neurodiversity are coming together, And then like, why is this harder if you're on that neurodiverse spectrum or in that group? So again, there will be some links at the end that you can go deeper into understanding sensory processing. But I just want to give you just a little bit of an insight and connect it to grief so we can talk about how to help. One of the keys is that we understand why it's overwhelming and what's happening inside of them. They're not being defiant. They don't want to be bad. They don't want to not listen. They don't want to get in trouble. They're not oppositional defiant. There are reasons that pushback and that opposition and that avoidance of it arises, but it really is linked to this sensory processing, the way that their brain is processing information and the way that it might get overloaded. So I just want to highlight that when I keep talking about sensory processing, because that is how our brain processes information, and neurodiversity is just the different way our brains process information. So we process, often we think about the five senses, right? You know, sight, smell, you know, touching, you know, the five kind of primary, what we see. But there are more, and there's probably more than we've yet identified. But there are some other ones that are really important to being able to regulate yourself. And one of them I just want to offer related to what we're talking about, grief and feelings and how neurodiverse grievers are expressing their grief, is this interoception. And so it says here, it's the eighth sense. But what it is it helps you feel what's going on inside your body. It helps you know. It helps you know you. It helps you know if you're hungry. It helps you know if you have to go to the bathroom, if you're tired. It also helps connect to emotions, to be able to feel them. Emotions are first sensations in our bodies. They're not actually just a story in our heads. And so for people who are neurodiverse, interoception may, those connections may be a little bit weaker. The wiring together may be a little bit weaker. And some, you know, obviously there's a spectrum. So there's people who have some access to kind of knowing and some who don't. And so asking questions like, how are you feeling? It's like, they got to go in, check in, like interoceptions, you know, for a neurotypical person, this is all just running really smoothly. You don't have to think about it. The gears don't get clunked up, but they go in, they don't know. Oftentimes neurodiverse people think like, what's wrong with me? I have heard many neurodiverse teenagers say to me, am I a psychopath? Because I don't feel those things. I think I care about people, but I can't feel the things I hear other people say. And that's so painful. We can build those skills. We can work with that. And we can also acknowledge it is part of just some of the difference in the way people are wired. But self-regulation is connected to our ability to manage our reactions to things, to what happens in our environment, to our internal world, to our feelings. And interoception is a key part of that. Sometimes being able to find language is really tough because you can't go in and get it. You can't even go in and get the sensation, like what is that like, versus, and then definitely can't find the language. I just wanted to share this with you. This is something I love. So it's just a bunch of pictures that I have printed off when I invite anyone, but this is especially helpful for neurodiverse brains. What does this feel like inside? Tell me what it feels like. You know, if you had to give it an image, tell me what it's like inside there right now with grief, with conflict, with that issue at school. Tell me what your brain feels like. What's it like to be in your brain? And these are cool. And sometimes people will be able to distinguish, well, when this is going on, it feels like, you know, the books are stacked everywhere and there's no order and I can't find anything. But, you know, when this other thing is happening, it's a little bit more like they're in the drawers, they're organized, but, you know, the drawers are kind of open and nothing's tidied up. You know, you get the idea. It's gonna be helpful. Okay. Another maybe check in. So interoception, you can let that go. Just the word go. Just remember, this is a key part of sometimes what's wired differently and impacting the way that a neurodiverse person is both experiencing and knowing, what's going on inside of them. So then what they're expressing out on top of what they're able to connect to for themselves. But this is bigger. So let's like zoom out. Interoception is a zoom in. Let's sensory processing. I've talked about it. It's the key of the why, back to that box, we're at the why. It says sensory modulation up there at the top, and it really means, sensory processing, how our brain's processing that information. I love this analogy, this image, to match the analogy from a sensorylife.com. I think it just kind of simplifies difficult to understand topic. But if you think about it like this, there's the conveyor belts. You see those there. Kind of just take in this image. Oh my gosh, that's a lot on the image. The conveyor belts are like our nervous system, right? So the structure of how messages get sent to and from brain and body. Our nerves are like the boxes that send the messages about what's happening internally with interoception, as I just said. And there's another sense, exteroception, like what's going on in the outer world. And there's so many others, as I said. And these nerves are embedded in our organs and our skin and, everywhere. And so they're like the boxes in the picture, going every which way. See that? The brain is the place in which these boxes are organized and sorted. And we talked earlier about executive functioning. That's, one of the juggler kind of does help do some of this organization and sorting. So in order to move through the day in a regulated way, a neurotypical person can speed up and slow down these conveyor belts depending on the task they're facing. There's a smoothness to that. They're able to be sort of flexible and adjust speed. And honestly, it doesn't take a ton of work for their brains and bodies to do that. That's the benefit of being neurotypical. A neurodiverse person, there's going to be almost more steps to this, if you will. And also they struggle, their brain struggles to match the pace of what's needed in the day. So much information coming in. I keep referring to things being kind of overstimulating, and that is true, but I also don't want to give the impression that it's always this fast pace, because back to this difference, some people have this fast pace, this kind of like hyperspeed, and things are coming in really, really fast, and that's overwhelming. It's just like input, and it creates this sped up kind of version of processing that then boxes are falling off the conveyor belts and there's big piles here and things aren't getting where they need to be to make sense and to get delivered on time. And then there's also kind of that slower processing, that hypo processing, not hyper, but hypo. And that's looking slower. It may take them more time to process what you've said. And so 4 questions in a row is going to just like, oh my gosh, the box, it's going to hijack. And it's also going to create anxiety. So that's what's happening here. It creates anxiety in the body. It feels like threat, feels like distress. Just when 3 or 4 questions are coming, a neurotypical person may be able to kind of handle those questions coming, and especially as a parent or caregiver, teacher, counselor, asking questions about maybe their grief experience, how they're feeling, all these things. That can impact what they're able to process, and also our assumptions, the assumptions we're making that they're not grieving or they're not able to process grief. Maybe they process slowly. I've certainly had clients like that where I have to remind myself, as you can tell, I talk fast. I can get going, I got to slow down. I've got to ask a question, wait, make space for that processor. Often they're quite deep processors. They're going deep, kind of slow instead of just zooming past. I hope that helps give an image to hold about the why. We have this, what I call a $1 million question at the Children's Grief Center. Most parents and caregivers come in and ask the question, like, how can I know what's grief and what's just bad behavior? And I think the question really is like, how do I know when to set these hard boundaries? And how do I know when to respond with care and compassion and gentleness? And so what I want to use that frame and say, I think when you talk about neurodiversity, it's like, what's just bad behavior and what's sensory? And we always want to think sensory first. I hope I just kind of gave you a glimpse into why. The way the information is coming is likely to be creating some sensory challenges. I love this quote. To remember this, grief is not for the observer, and it's not for the observer to decide if it's good grief, healthy grief, normative grief. It's also, like not for like parents and counselors and teachers. Grief is for the griever, for the neurodiverse griever who is doing their own process of moving, inner world, outer world, and adjusting to the loss of this likely important person in their world. And so the way, if grief is really a little bit the journey of that adjustment, that transition, and you think about the neurodiverse, kids or teens that you support, adjustment and transition is hard. And their grief process is not for our evaluation, for the observer. It's for them. Okay. Going to move to that last box, the how to help. I just want to kind of run these down. We've talked about a few things here, and I just want to highlight them. So I just wanted them all on one page for you. So I think I've talked quite a bit about grief and context. So we just want to remember that. We're only talking about one context today, like the neurodiverse context, and there's so many more. And so today I'm just inviting you to consider this one context, but of course you want to bring this information into your child, the child you're supporting, whole context. Number 2, just be literal. Don't use metaphors or euphemisms for talking about death and dying. And again, we have that lunch and learn where we talk about that, why that matters and how that can be confusing, and particularly for a neurodiverse, very literal, very concrete thinker, that is often not a helpful way to talk about grief and death. And so we just want to use, literal terms, and you can use examples in nature to help make those connections. Likely they already know that. So it's like connecting this new thing to a thing that they know. So it can help with the processing. Connected to that, you want to provide the information support to their developmental age. Sometimes we think, they're 14, but they may not be. At times, there's some lagging skills, some lagging pieces of development. Sometimes they're not very obvious, but you'll know as their parent. So you just really want to pay attention to their developmental age versus their biological age as you provide information and the support that it matches. And just that accurate, truthful information. Again, if you're needing kind of like a specific guide on how to talk about that, check out the Lunch and Learn on the web there. This is a big one. Explain other people's emotions and reactions. Explain what they can expect, because it is a reality that they often, that exteroception, that taking in the information from outside, they often don't have that feeling inside. They can't connect it to what they're seeing outside. You just want to kind of make a plan with them, help them understand. I'm going to give you an example of that, of what they might see in other people and what that means. There's that myth out there that autism in particular, but neurodiverse people don't, they're not empathic, or that they don't feel big feelings or feel the feelings of others. And that is actually quite untrue. In fact, it's probably more likely that the energy and the emotions of other people are so overstimulating when you think about that sensory input, that there sometimes is a little bit of an avoidance or a disconnection from that as a way of staying regulated. And so by giving them that explanation and what they can expect and what they can do about it, that can help, kind of keep them in their boots if they're in a situation where that's coming up, like a funeral, for example, or an anniversary kind of acknowledgement of the person's death. This is connected to have a plan. Have a plan with them. I'm going to give you an example of that just on the next slide. Back to, they derive a huge sense of safety and security from a plan, from a script. What can I do? What is expected of me there? And even when it comes to, say, like an event, that's going to take a lot of resources for them, that it's going to be so costly for them. There's going to be so much input that their brain has to sort through that your brain doesn't. I sometimes think I forget that. So many automatic things my brain's doing that they have to actually their brain has to do, and they're aware of that process happening. Sometimes that's why it can be slower. You want to have room for compromise in that plan. I know that suits, really dressy clothes are often common at a funeral, but that's going to be an input that might just be so dysregulating for a neurodivergent person, or certain smells or sounds, or not having food that is comforting, or that they can even tolerate, the texture of. So making a plan with a compromise. And then I love this line that I took from a woman. I actually don't have her source, but it's not mine. And I just love it. I think it's a good thing to have in your back pocket. On top of helping kids have a script for what they may want to say to others. This is good for neurotypical kids as well. This may be what we encounter, and here's what you may want to do. I love this. In the unlikely event that we can't do X, in the unlikely event that we can't get sandwiches that you like at the celebration of life or whatever, or in the unlikely event that you can't sit in the seat that we're planning on, make the next plan, plan B. A lot of security, a lot of, just front-loaded regulation capacity when we do that. Again, I already said this, think sensory first. So we want to, if there is overwhelm happening and it looks like bad behavior, we want to consider the environment. Let's reduce the sensory bombardment is the word that I wrote here on them, and then kind of move into some of those other pieces of regulation, and back to not feelings, but problem solving first, maybe then feelings, but reduce the sensory bombardment, and then we'll kind of do some of these other pieces. So I just want to acknowledge co-anchoring and co-regulating. I think I already spoke to the co-regulating, but the co-anchoring I just wanted to highlight because I had a slide where I was sharing common features of neurodiverse grief, and on there I wrote they have these sensory anchors. And really, those are those behaviors, those traits, and they don't just exist in autism as kind of we think about stemming or something like that. The movements in lots of ways, people with OCD have some behaviors that they do that bring a sense of calm, and trying to organize the sensory input, right? Regulate their nervous system and organize information that's coming in through their senses. ADHD, in neurodiverse people have all kinds of different ways, and so do neurotypical people. Humming is a way that people don't even know there's helping organize their system when they're starting to feel maybe stressed or overwhelmed, or I'm kind of spinning in my seat a little bit as I'm doing this talk. So you can co-anchor. So when your kid, and there's some sensory anchors, and I'm calling them that because I don't like the negative connotation that we sometimes have with traits or behaviors around these things. But these sensory anchors, they know work for them. Join them in them. That's really the best way to do that versus, oh my gosh, you're so hyper, go do da 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 da. Join. That's part of the co-regulating. One last thing I want to give you here. We're going to talk about it. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but this, if I think about one of the important ways you can help a neurodiverse griever in times of stress and overwhelm, it's this last one, using declarative language. Don't worry, I'm not going to give you a grammar course. I'm not a big fan of, ELA, English language, but arts, but I do want to highlight it for you because I want to acknowledge, I'm talking about grief and neurodiversity and the value, and I believe all of that, and the incredible benefits and gifts that come in neurodiversity. And then there are some challenges because they are functioning in a neurotypical world with neurotypical expectations that really are often a mismatch for the way that their brain and body are processing information and able to cope. So as parents, I recognize it can be a lot. And honestly, I probably just don't even have time to honor that. Yes, it's a lot. And it's exhausting. Sometimes there's just a huge feeling of inadequacy. I can't get it right for this kid because sometimes they're fluctuating. Shame, all of those pieces. guilt. But these are just some of the ways that I hope as you're listening, are like normalizing for you. Like, of course, these things are hard for your young person. And of course, it's challenging to help support and co-anchor and co-regulate this young person. So declarative language is a way we can do that. And I just want to offer you a little glimpse into that. But before, remember I said I would give you an example of like having a plan. There is a link in the chat about to 3 or 4 of these from the University of Indiana. If you're watching the Lunch and Learn at a later date, just kind of Google that, Indiana University, grief, and maybe it might be neurodiversity, it might be autism. And there's 3 or 4 PDFs for different situations. When you're talking about, this one is going to a funeral. There's some about talking about a person who's dying. As you can see here, there's some pictures, there's some visuals. It's very concrete. It's very linear, it's sequential, which is helpful for them as they process and what they can expect, what might be happening there, what will be happening there, what might they expect to see in other people. You'll see that at the funeral, people will be sad and they might cry. I might be sad and might cry. It's okay, right? And so you see there's that preparation. Of course, this is just an example, so not totally my favorite one, but I think it's a really good example. You obviously want to curate it to your own situation. So, if someone's being cremated, then obviously you would want to include those details versus a casket and what is going to be kind of the process of the day they can expect. And again, this may be at an anniversary celebration, or honoring. It might be for a birthday of the person who has died. It may be the holidays, going back to school, when you can imagine that some of those transitions in the absence of the person and watching other people, or if the situation they're going to go has a lot of unspoken expectations that neurodiverse people just are often, because their brain is processing so much, not able to pick up on, and sometimes just the way they're wired, as we kind of already talked about. So just give you that. I hope you check out that website if that's helpful. And then the last thing around language, I just want to say, I love this. We want so badly for our children to speak to us, to share their world, that we try and we pull it out of them. When we do this, we create anxiety, disconnection. If we're prompting, questioning, and demanding they speak, I find myself doing this. I really want to know. I really want to get to the heart of it. And I really want to help. And so sometimes that looks like my approach is prompting, questioning, demanding, and at such a fast pace that my son begins to shut down and disconnect. So let's just talk about that before we close up today. Declarative language, as I said, it won't be a grammar lesson, but thinking about, so declarative language invites sharing. Declarative language is a comment, a description, sharing your own feelings and experience. It's not an imperative that says, give me something back, So imperatives create anxiety, avoidance, and sometimes opposition. And I really did want to offer you that reminder, because a lot of neurodiverse kids get labeled sort of oppositional, avoidant or oppositional. And that is coming because their system is completely overwhelmed. The sensory modulation is not working as effectively as it needs to for the situation they're in. And so it's going to create avoidance and opposition, shutdown, and meltdown, shutdown, in order to create a little space for processing. And this is a really, I hope, a valuable tool for you. It has been for me. So imperatives are when you want to direct them rather than relate to them. So think about that. Of course, in parenting or in teaching or any of those things, there is space where we have to be directive. But when you're wanting to come alongside and you're wanting to understand grief and you're wanting them to share about their grief, it's not the time for directives. It's the time for relating. And so what might that sound like? So here's a little list. Declarative language might sound like this. I wonder if. So you're sharing your own observations, right? Or your own experience. Because if you remember interoception, it's a bit more of a clunkier system for them. So when you ask them the question, they have to go in and get it. And even if they can get it, and they have to come back out and formulate that to share out with you in a way that makes sense, to you and to them. And sometimes when you make these declarative statements, you allow them just to do that a little quicker. because you've offered them an option. And also you haven't created that feeling of anxiety or panic around responding in a way that is okay, because a lot of neurodiverse kids have had an experience for a long time of being corrected and getting it wrong. And they do have some of that like performance anxiety, response anxiety. So these are really important things to remember. So you can see that list. Let me give you, if you're like me and you hate grammar, let me give you just like the side by side here. An imperative, like I said, question, prompt, directive will sound like, what is the matter? But a declarative that invites relating will say, you look upset. So you've given them something to test their own reality with. Am I upset? Nope. Yep. Do you want to talk about, if we're talking about grief, so that's an imperative. Do you want to talk about dad? Did you want to talk about papa? Do you want to talk about your feelings about? Instead of a declarative that says, I've noticed you seem sad lately, or I've noticed that it looks like it's been harder for you to get up and go to school. That's your invitation. That's the invitation into relating. What do you miss about? The intention's right. Like our intention as neurotypical people is good, but it creates anxiety. It creates that kind of that processing traffic jam, and it's not helpful. So sometimes I miss. Also, let me say, I talked to my son about this and I asked permission to share this. His comment to me was, he doesn't mind the questions. He said it first. And then I said, yeah, but think about the questions or the commands, the directives, the prompts that you get all day long. And then I give you one. And he's like, oh, right. So that's what we're holding on to. This isn't just like a one and out. It's like, think of their context. Okay, think of their day. Think of what they've experienced. A lot of kids at school are experiencing imperatives all day long. And for a lot of neurotypical kids, they're processing that, they're letting it go. But neurodiverse kids, it is a lot of pressure. It's a lot of input. So you can see some of those, that other example. Try rephrasing the imperatives that you normally use, flip them. Try it as a declarative statement, invite relating. Does that make sense? I hope so. Lastly, I'm going to give you this. This is just a way to think about what we were talking about when I said how to help. Think about sensory bombardment, all of those things. So when you're thinking, this is just bad behavior. Is this sensory or is this behavior? Let's think sensory first and let's go this route. I'm not saying it's never bad behavior. Real talk, but often behavior is a signal. And for neurodiverse people, a signal that there is a sensory overload happening. And so we want to do that. We want to stop, assess it. Don't assume it's behavior first. Change the environment, right? Eliminate that bombardment of sensory input as best you can, create compromise, all of those things. And then pay attention. Was that effective? Have you seen that start to work? What's their response to that change? And some of those sensory strategies and tools that I'm sure you already have in your kit as a parent, parenting neurodiverse kids. And also, if you need some support thinking about that, sensory anchors is a great way to think of it. You and your child, teen might be exploring what sensory anchors feel good, what feel regulating. And then that last thing, paying attention to what's working, learn from it. It's not failure. Learn for the next time. Offer your child that same kind of perspective. So sense. I'm going to offer you these resources as we close up. Some of my favorites. Autism discussion pages on Facebook. And I wanted to offer that, even though it says autism, one of the things that is really the heart of the work on there is just this acknowledgement around sensory processing and how it impacts functioning. And so I've found that it really, you could, there's some very specific autistic pieces, but mostly you could really kind of switch out neurodiversity, and there's a lot of fitting things. Tilt Parenting has a great podcast for parents who are parenting neurodiverse kids, just all over, that collection of diversity. And it is really hard and sometimes isolating. It's isolating to be a griever, and it's isolating to parent neurodiverse kids a lot of the time. And so finding the supports in your real life or virtually, if that's not available to you, I think is invaluable. And that's a great place. I have really loved that. And then I wanted to offer you the understood.org. I just wanted to point out that's such a great resource. They have just things just all across. You want to know more about sensory processing, go there. Executive functioning, go there. One of my favorite, and specific learning disabilities, lots on that. One of my favorite things they have on there is that through your child's eyes section, and it gives you sort of, I can't think of the word off the top of my head, but like this modulated experience, I've lost it, but this, you get to kind of experience, they've created this activity where you get to experience what it's like to be in your child's brain. With whatever their particular challenges, sensory processing, dysgraphia as a writing, as a learning dyslexia, learning disability, or there's other anxiety, there's those other pieces. And I have found it's been so valuable to create empathy and understanding for, oh my gosh, look at how hard my kid is working. Because sometimes kids, neurodiverse kids, like particularly with school, can be accused of being lazy or not paying attention. And just, I think when we just gain an awareness of their context, it's a spacious place for creating room to understand that they are working so much harder than actually a neurotypical kid just to get through the day. And when we're talking about grief, as I've mentioned throughout, it's kind of an added challenge. And I hope this session has given some concrete info. And as you support your grieving kids, feel free, as I said, to, take what fits, leave what doesn't. We are at the end of our Lunch and Learn sessions for this series, like 2021 to 2022. So hope to see you in the fall, and we hope to widen the sessions to include some community partners for some other, areas that come up a lot for our families. If you have ideas, you're welcome to email us if there's a topic you're dying for us to cover. info@childrensgriefcenter.ca. Shoot us an email, they'll pass it on to me. I think that's it. Okay, thanks for joining us, and I hope you have a great